Hello, everyone. So before I begin, I want to apologize that I'm not going to be running the presentation on my own laptop. So it's going to be a slightly different presentation. Hopefully it works. This is Jen's laptop who graciously shared it with us. So my name is Guillermo Rauch. I'm the CEO of a company called Zeit. We make a product for one-command deployment of any application. It's called Now. So if you're interested in learning more about what's behind this technology that we call Next, you can go to Zeit.co, and you're going to see, I show you here how you can, with one command, deploy an application in any directory, any type of application, any programming language, even static files, just with one command, Now. So when we set out to create Now, we saw an opportunity to simplify deployment to the point where something that used to take weeks or then hours and minutes or multiple commands and orchestrations, we got it down to one command. So I've been using React for a few years now, and before that I built a lot of single-page applications, and I was always very upset with how many commands and all these things I had to configure for creating a really performant application that had JavaScript on the front end, but also was server rendered. So the premise of Next is what we call universal React.js, because it renders on the server like traditional Web 1.0 applications like PHP, but also it allows you to pick up on the client, resume rendering, and do anything you really want to do with JavaScript on the front end. So it kind of gives you the best of both worlds. So that's what we mean when we talk about universal. It works everywhere. Same code base, server and client. React.js, cool technology. Can I get a sense, please raise your hands if you've already written React.js applications. All right, so and within that half, how many of you have heard about Next? All right, it's an interesting distribution. So today we have an hour, and I've only given this presentation once, and it was in 30 minutes. And the feedback that I had was I was talking too fast and going too fast. So today, and especially because not everyone knows about React, I'm going to basically explain everything from scratch, so, which is great. So I make a distinction here between making something easy and simple. Easy is something that we can quantify, because if you launch an application with one command, it's objectively easier than if you run 20 commands. They took 5 minutes each, you got distracted, you went to Twitter, you went to grab a cup of coffee, then you saw an error, it didn't work, you come back 20 minutes later, so that's not easy. But simple is a less clear and less concrete notion. So when I talk about simplicity, first of all, I'm going to talk about well-defined boundaries. Next.js is a framework, and frameworks sometimes get a bad reputation for doing too much. So I think a key idea behind this idea of simplicity has to be that the framework is very predictable, has well-defined boundaries, you know what it does and what it doesn't do, and what to complete it with. It supports emergent behavior, and by this I mean that you can take Next or a Next.js application and combine it with a lot of other building blocks that are out there, not created by the framework authors themselves, and create really cool combinations of technology. So I'm going to show a lot of examples of combining Next with existing React components, with existing NPM modules. So this framework doesn't require that you reinvent everything from scratch. And also that it behaves consistently. So the learning curve of this framework is actually probably like 10 minutes. So if you want to check it out later, I apologize, this is not my laptop. I do not use Yahoo. You can go to, yeah, no offense to Yahoo, but the results are not that great. So this is basically the entire README of the framework, and you learn everything from how to install it and how to start a project. You install the dependencies with NPM. You create your first page, which is going to show a hello world, and then that's it. Bliss. So it goes into how to do CSS with this, how to populate the head. For example, a lot of single-page applications struggle with how do I add a Twitter card for a particular page. So it's often necessary to edit the head element of the rendered page and so on, how to get data. We're going to get into this more, but the bottom line is you can probably go through this entire README in one afternoon. So that's really neat.
Increase the resolution.
For sure. Let me know when I stop. Just kidding. All right, perfect. And also, whenever I show tabs, but that tab was github.com/zeit/next.js. So, yeah, the idea of React is you can define components that are very composable. So I can take a component that's on GitHub and I can add my own component, pass it as children components. It's a very neat separation of concerns that allows you to work effectively within a team. So even this presentation, we can say, the top left is a logo component. So if you're familiar with web components, you can think of React components as a superset of web components. They allow you to do more interesting stuff like passing functions and making abstract components and a few other interesting things. And obviously here we're rendering a slide. So we have a slide component and then we have a paragraph or title. So these are basically how we would split up the components within this page. And the other thing that Next does is whenever you create a React application, there are a lot of decisions you have to make, especially if you want to send it to production. And getting the details right between the environments, saying like, okay, this is how I build it for development, this is how I do it for production, it gets really messy. So for me, the reason that I created Next is I started noticing that a lot of the websites that I used every single day, like Hacker News, like GitHub, they weren't this new cool single page applications. They actually rendered on the server and they were very effective at doing that. So this is what Hacker News looked like in the, I think probably that's from 2007. Probably the exact same. Like you can't really tell that this site has changed significantly. Yet this is where everyone goes to talk about the latest JavaScript frameworks. So there is a little bit of a paradox there. Like, okay, we're using a medium that is not really that modern, like it's not using all this cool JS technology, yet it works really well, right? So because it works really well, it hasn't needed to change significantly over time. It looks very fast. And server-rendered applications are as fast as they can be because you make a request to the server and immediately starts streaming down the resulting HTML with the data that you're interested in. It really doesn't get any better than that. And building it was probably easy and simple because the topology that we're discussing is very simple, client-server requests. The markup involved is very simple. Every piece in here was very easy to put together. Therefore, it hasn't needed really to change that much. You haven't had to rewrite this application every single year. So what I wanted for Next was I should be able to build something like that so that in 20 years, it's still the same thing. And I also wanted to have the ability, for example, that if there are new comments coming into a story, you should be able to render them in real time. So obviously, there is a power limit to how much you can do with server-only rendered applications. So Next is trying to straddle that entire power spectrum. So you can use it for simple websites, or you can use it for really sophisticated single-page or multi-page applications. And the programming model is this component-oriented programming model that React describes. So the first, one of the first demos that I created with this is Next News. So Next News is the exact clone of Hacker News. Something interesting here is this is not an iframe. So notice that I'm going back and forth between my slides. This is actually the entire application that I was able to embed within my other application. And I'll get into this now because I didn't actually write this deck in Keynote. I wrote it in Next itself. So that's why it has a URL, and that's why you can see that there is a URL specifically for each slide. So the interesting thing here is the component model is so powerful, especially the way that Next uses it, that you can get a level of CSS isolation, for example, that allows me to embed the exact application that I would otherwise access through Yahoo. Next News.now.sh, I was able to embed it completely in here. So I think that's a testament to how well this componentization works. So if we edit the, so typically at this point in the presentation I show the React Dev Tools, but I think they're not on this laptop. So every single one of these divs was generated by a component. And let's check out the source code for that for a second. So you can see here I have my components folder, and within it I have every single React component that was used to generate this application, together with its CSS styles. For those of you not familiar with this syntax, I'm embedding HTML, so to speak, inside JavaScript. This is called JSX. And this is what, for those of you that are familiar with template-oriented server-side solutions such as PHP or Java Server Pages, JSP, this is a very similar mental model in that you're basically exporting a function, which in PHP would be the file itself, and then that function is returning just a bunch of HTML with data inside. So that's how basically Next.js works, and the same goes for this deck. Every single one of these pages is itself a top-level component. So Next itself allows you to introduce plugins for transforming the source code. It comes with a preset of plugins because obviously this is not valid out-of-the-box ECMAScript, JavaScript. So we had to include a Babel plugin to transform this into the JavaScript form, which is a bunch of React.createElement calls. So, but in addition to those default compiler plugins that we ship with, we're able to include custom ones. So what I did for this slide is I introduced a Babel plugin that allows me to embed the file that I'm rendering right now. So it's a little meta, but notice that I'm calling this include function. What the compiler is doing is it's coming into this file and it's replacing the include function with the complete source of this function, of this component. So this entire thing, which is what renders this page, is being embedded inside the code component, which is this purple thing. Very cool. So Next.js has been in production at Zeit for probably a little bit longer than a year now, like a year and 1 month. And what we do with it is we created this really awesome high-performance application that performs like a single-page application because notice that everything is instantaneous, yet it does automatic code splitting. So every click that I'm making here is like a sub-application. So this is one of the really nice built-in features about Next. Whenever you start writing a JavaScript project, one of the defaults that a lot of people often get wrong is they think that there's going to be one giant bundle, .js, that is the entire application. Whereas notice that like every single thing here has an interesting level of sophistication inside. So for example, the API has an embedded code mirror editor with VI mode. So I don't want to load that when I go to the homepage because I want that to be snappy for like first-time visitors. Similarly, when I log in, we get an entire new set of features for looking at your deployments and so on, and your applications. So Next.js marries these two concepts of it has to be snappy, yet you want to code split your application into discrete bundles. And it introduces a feature called prefetching for doing this, which I'm going to get into in a bit. Oh, so I actually had forgot about this, but I actually embedded Zeit within this presentation as well, just to make that point. So something interesting that the component model gives you is by creating pure components that you then compose into your pages, it's almost like you get a style guide out of the box. So I'm going to show how at Zeit, everything that we create, we can show within a style guide with very, very minimal effort. Because it's this idea of everything that you create, you can embed anywhere, and it's very like, it's like you're creating Lego blocks, essentially. So I'll share basically how to start with Next, all the way to like what's going to happen to it in the future. So the very first premise of Next is that you start with pages. Very similar again to how you would, with ASP or PHP, you would start with files representing discrete URLs. So the idea here is to introduce very minimal convention that we think is required for production high-performance applications. So the first thing we decided to do was any sufficiently, or the very first premise that we started with, any sufficiently complicated or interesting application will have many entry points. So the obvious example is if I send this blog post to someone, that's an entry. Oh, sorry. It's like Yahoo is invading my presentation. So that's an obvious entry point into the application. I'm going directly into the blog, and I'm going directly into a specific blog post. Something that's interesting here is this blog post is actually using also all the components shares components with the rest of the application, but Next is in charge of bundling them into discrete JS files that are served automatically. And the invariant number 2 is you never want to load more code that is strictly necessary for that entry point. So you don't want to go to the home page and load the settings panel. Yet most of the applications that are shipped to production in many cases do that. They create like one gigantic app bundle that contains every single possible path in the future. And this is actually not something that is limited to web applications. So even command line applications would benefit from splitting them in entry points. So an example that I show is npm run. Whenever you run npm run, pardon the GIF download speed, it's very dramatic effect, but it's actually not this slow. It takes an extra 500 milliseconds to run anything that you supply to npm run. And the reason is npm run is actually loading the entire code base for the npm CLI. So you could see how, in order to improve the performance of this, the obvious next step is to code split. And that's why Next.js decided to not bother with anything that's not an application that does code splitting. So my internet right now is suffering a little bit. Okay. So, like I said, code split is useful even for command line applications. So what this addresses is what I call the single page application syndrome, which is, you go to the about page of your company and you're downloading something that's completely unrelated. And the convention that we introduced to make this happen is every project that you create with Next has a pages directory. That's the only thing you require. And within that pages directory, you define all your top-level components that are mapped automatically to URLs, although you can override that later. But for example, if I go to Next News again, and if I go to the comments, notice that I'm transitioning to item. So what is that mapped to? Item.js. So what this does is it exposes a component. We call this top-level components. There is a data fetching step. This is an interesting thing about Next, is that the data fetching logic is completely up to you. You can use whatever system you want. And in fact, because the Hacker News API is exposed through Firebase, I get the data from Firebase and get initial props. But you could use you could make AJAX calls, you could make RESTful API calls, GraphQL.
Please make the toxic recipe.
Oh yeah, I forgot about GitHub, I apologize. So a recap. Inside the item.js top-level component, which is here, I export a component, and then I get the data for it. Notice there's something really interesting here. I'm only loading the comments if there is a request object. So a request object is actually only present if you server rendered. So if I refresh this entire page, it's going to get the entire comments with the page. But if I go back to the home and I go to an item, notice that there was a loading. It was too fast in this case. And there are no comments in this case. But you see the loading there. Actually, I'm going to also make this bigger. So that's where I took a departure from cloning Hacker News like pixel by pixel, because I wanted to show off this capability that you can decide how the props are fetched for each top-level component. And what's really cool is you can fetch them from a cache. So you don't even have to fetch from the server here. You could fetch from client state. You could fetch from Redux, local storage, offline databases, and so on. Very cool. Wow. So I had a backup screenshot here. Great. So one thing that this has as an interesting emergent property is that you get a Next.js project and you immediately know how to get around it. So there's an emergent convention. I call it emergent because you don't necessarily have to do this, but you can define a couple folders, components, lib, and pages in this case. And what I usually end up doing is, pages are obviously my top-level components. This is a requirement. But then inside the lib directory, I have usually data transformation utilities, like rendering a date as time ago as opposed to the absolute date and things like that. And in components, I usually have my components that do not do any data fetching whatsoever. So for example, the logo is a very standalone thing. I'm going to increase the font size. CC Scott. The header, comments. I'll show you the comment component because this one is interesting. Notice that in order for the comment component to be meaningful, it has to get data. So components are at a very basic level or mental model. They're just like functions that take in some data and return a combination of HTML tags and styles. So this one is a little bit of an interesting component because, and notice that I use a class here. I'm exporting a class for this comment component, and I'm not exporting a function like in this component because the comment component is what we call stateful. And the state, which I should have clarified here, so I'm going to make a quick commit. Oh, I'm not logged in. It's Jen's computer. So I usually initialize the state saying toggled false because that's the default state. So that's why this component is stateful, because it can be in two states, toggled or not toggled. So components can actually contain behavior and events and so on, but they still remain self-contained. For example, notice that here I have nested components. So I can have like fractal representation of state. And if all those components get removed from the screen, for example, their events and state and whatever gets garbage collected. So I'll show you how that works. Here in my span, I define an onClick function that goes to toggle. Toggle is my toggle function, which should be somewhere here. And all it does is it alternates that switch between being toggled and not toggled. And then the render function gets called again with the new data. So this is a very nice mental model if you're used to server-rendered applications, because you're always re-rendering everything top-down. So now render returns the entire comment again. But if toggled was set to true, I include no children. However, if it's not toggled, I include itself, which is really cool. So this component is called comment, and if it receives children comments as an array, this is basically just data, JavaScript objects, arrays, and so on. So I iterate through those comments, and I include the component itself. So that's what gives us that fractality here. Okay, so what is a cool consequence of having this convention? So first of all, when you're working on a page, anyone else is working on a different page is working on their own JavaScript and CSS bundle. So if someone in the team decides to include jQuery, Ember, Angular, and React in one page, they're really messing only with their page. So this is really cool because it means it's scalable for teams. There's also a very interesting distinction that we just made between the building block or Lego block components and the top-level components. which gives you this automatic style guide. So I call it SketchUp in your browser. So here I embedded our own style guide, but it basically took no effort to make because all these components that we use were already inside that components folder. So I just went and said import message from components, and then I created actually a component called artboard, which is this white nice thing with a box shadow. So that's all it takes really to like share with your team what components you're working on. And like I said, components can actually be stateful. So this is a responsive image component. This is really useful because you have to reinvent this for every project. But once you create it, you put it here, the rest of your team sees it, and no one ever again creates an image that doesn't resize properly or flickers when it loads and so on. It's really nice. Another neat thing of this is you can test this is like functional testing for a component, for UI, because you can give it fake data in this Lego block form, right? So like here I'm saying the batch with 1 digit, 2 digits, and 3 digits. So when I was creating this, I actually, this batch sucked actually, because I think it didn't work for 2 and 3 digits. But then I can sort of test it, and like you can impose limits, for example. So I have another example here. So if any of these menu items was really long, it would get capped to a maximum. Yeah, so here, for example, like our users can only be 16 letters and digits. So if it's longer because it was legacy before we implemented that restriction in the API, very long story, it would display the ellipsis. So I was able to test my menu component with data values that are relevant to our application, but that on a day-to-day basis, maybe your test user is called test. So you never run into any of these edge cases. So it's really nice to be able to see them here. And this is an example of a stateful component because it's triggering behavior. So because they're building blocks, it doesn't mean that they don't have associated state or behavior. So you can sort of create a very comprehensive style guide with even behavior and so on. So, this is within the presentation. I got inceptioned. So I'm going to go to the top. Okay, so the top level components that go inside pages are just components. They have the exact same signature and API as React components. So obviously, if you want to learn Next, the only prerequisite is that you know how to create React components. And you add this get initial props hook optionally if you need to do data fetching. And like I said earlier with that example of comments, you can decide how much or how little you want to render. The rule that I follow for deciding how much to render on the server, how much to render on the client is, for a given entry point, what's the thing that the user absolutely wants to see immediately? So, for example, if you go to /news, you want to see the news. So anything but the news would be suboptimal. So that's an example of seeing the news. I want that to be loaded all at once. Technically, we can also get into a discussion of maybe we want to load the first 10 because the rest we can load lazily as the user scrolls or as the page loads so that we have even a more performant server render. So for item, if I make that transition client side, maybe I want to write a comment, maybe I want to see the first 5 items and so on. So that's where you can make a distinction. And the other rule that you can follow to decide how many of those props you get to render a certain page is can my server actually answer quickly? So there's an example on the Instagram Explorer page. I did not embed Instagram. This is I don't have their source code. But in the Discover page, they make recommendations of who to discover. That for me was the Kardashian family when I took this screenshot. So that API call that gets the discovered people took like 2.5 seconds. So you might not want to server render that because instead of being able to display your layout and a nice spinner and so on, you'd have made the user wait 2 seconds seeing nothing on their browser until that page comes through. So it comes down to like, what spinner do you want to render? Because browsers actually handle that quite elegantly. If a page takes a long time to load, they show a spinner and so on. So with this, you can with this model, you could even leverage a cache that exists only in the client of the things that they've probably explored before, for example. So the other condiment there is if you pre-render a layout and then you do that very quickly, it typically feels faster to the end user. So that's nice. And you get offline support. So the other really neat addition of Next is it gives you this link component. I'm going to show you an example of that link component. Oh, here, probably. Stories. So let's go back to Hacker News or Next News or Hacker Next. So we have this more link here. So when I click it, notice that you saw that orange thing at the top. So we are making the transition between the pages. We don't have to do that because we could have relied on a simple browser transition, right? If we server render, we don't need to do that transition on the client. In fact, if you look at my anchor here, it's just a regular anchor. And I'm actually going to take it out so I can demonstrate that if I click it, actually it retained the event listener, never mind. But if I had clicked it.
Make that bigger and I saw some color flash.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I increased the right-hand side now. So going back to that example, the more link, which I accidentally just clicked, is making a client-side transition. We are controlling that transition. We're rendering our own transition animation, for example, which is, in our case, is that slim bar at the top. But since we server render, we don't have to do that. We could have made a regular link. The reason that we don't do that is a couple things. One is, with the link component that Next gives you, you can prefetch pages that you haven't clicked yet automatically by just adding this little prefetch attribute. So that's going back to our website. That's why every click is instantaneous, even though I haven't been there. In fact, I could start an incognito session, no cache. And if I click about, it was already pre-cached. So in this case, it's pre-caching in the order that it finds them in the document. But we also have an imperative API so that you could decide the policy for prefetching. We actually have one such policy, which is if you right-click our logo, you can download our logos. And that was instantaneous as well. And the reason is when you hover, I'm invoking router.prefetch/logos. So it's almost like I'm creating a link that doesn't exist, because there's no such link. You have to right-click. Link only applies for regular clicks. So that's what makes Next applications give you the performance benefits of single-page applications without the drawbacks. And also, so there is that thing. There is a prefetching, which is enough to justify making client-side transitions. But there is also the ability to preserve client state. So when I make that transition, I'm not losing my JavaScript state. So like, let's say I said A equals 5, and I go home, and I press A, it's still 5. So I'm retaining my own client-side cache. So obviously, storing A is not meaningful. But for example, I didn't do this. I should have done this, but I had no time. When I go back, right now, we're retrieving all the stories again. But we could have made an optimization that if I'm going back client-side, I could have gotten that list from a cache. Because typically when you press back, people expect the data to already be there, not to refetch it. So that's why it's important to make client-side transitions. That's why it's important that we introduced this link component and the router primitives. Another great example is authentication. If you render a page, we want to say, who is this user? Or are they logged in or not? So for example, here I have my login button. But if I log in, and then I click another page that also is interested in whether the user is authenticated or not, we don't want to check again for authentication. We just checked a second ago, and we still have that in-memory cache. So authentication is another great example of why you want to make client-side translations of pages. Actually, we also have a really interesting hook in there for login state synchronization. So when this animated GIF finishes loading, you're going to see it in action. The cursor is moving very slowly. So in case you can't see it, I'm going to change sections. Very slow. I should have used MP4s. It's probably like 100 megabyte GIF. Let's check it out. Oh, I just cleared it. It's almost done. So what I'm doing on the left-hand side is I'm going to press logout. Without the adaptive streaming capabilities. It's downloading every pixel. Do you have any questions so far while we wait for this GIF to painfully load? Scott.
When you were showing the different components and how it gets mixed, JavaScript and HTML, the part I was having trouble understanding is, and this is an old person's question, like when you do a view source and you see the HTML, that's what I use to then style it. But with this, you never really see the result except in F12 tool. Do you do all your CSS styling?
Yeah, that's a great question.
How do you see the big picture?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's actually one of the first things I wanted to show my component structure is you can add the Reactive Tools here. So you can see your components interleaved with the elements that they generated. So when you inspect with the Reactive Tools, when you inspect this, you would still, header. When you see our logo, you would still see the resulting elements, but you would see also something like this on top. You would see, and in a different color. So it would tell you, these are coming all from the logo component. But the other interesting thing is there's usually a very neat mapping between the elements that you generate here and what you're going to get in return. Sometimes no, because for example, and that's why this is different from web components, this link component never gets rendered. It just adds behavior to the children components. So,
Which as an ASP.NET web form developer 15 years ago, I find strange.
yeah, that's an interesting remark because there have been a lot of things like this before. In fact, there was an attempt to get XML into JavaScript at some point. So a lot of this actually will seem familiar. This is kind of like an abstract component that gets a children component. All our link is doing really is saying, okay, A becomes A on click equals router dot push this URL and it prefetches as a side effect. It just doesn't get rendered. So styling is actually really nice because what we do is so the XML inside, or this syntax inside JavaScript is called JSX. So we have this compiler add-on called styled JSX. So it's just the CSS that you already know, but it only gets applied to the elements that are defined within this component.
Does it turn into a generated name?
Yes, a data attribute. So if we go back, and that's really, I lost it. Okay, you saw the end result there. It logged out both tabs. So, but going back to that, which the presentation goes into, but it's a really interesting part of this is you don't need to learn a new styling system. You just use CSS in a way that's friendly to components, because all the style rules get isolated. And I'll show you the result in the dev tools in a second. Okay. So let's go to the logo component to check it out. We're gonna go to components, logo. So this is just, what component is this? Oh, this is Hacker News, never mind. So let's go to Hacker News then. So I have a logo here, which is just an N. And it's a span class logo. The typical issue that you run into building big applications is if you define a selector for spans, you're pretty quickly gonna go crazy because it will apply to all the spans in the world. But our compiler looks for all the attributes, all the elements within this closure, and it appends a data attribute. So see that data attribute called data JSX? So then it goes to the CSS and it rewrites the CSS. So the CSS is actually now logo data JSX. Second? Right. So it's exclusive. That data JSX attribute is exclusive to that component.
Would that not cause a Cartesian product of CSS and big giant CSS code?
Say again?
Would that not cause like a multiplicative effect and have like a lot of duplicate rules?
No, because this is an implementation detail that those of you that are familiar with React will appreciate. The style JSX element gets turned into a component. So the distinction between components and elements is that you probably saw that earlier. They just start with an uppercase letter, and they have to be imported. So here, logo is a component, span is an element. So what our compiler does is it turns this into a component, and then the component keeps track of how many times it appears for that particular value, and it only injects the underlying style tag once. So if you have 100 logos of Hacker News in your page, or 100 paragraphs, I mean, obviously you're not gonna have 100 logos. Notice that in fact here in the logo, if this had been compiled directly into React code, we would have seen a style element underneath, but there's no such thing. It's because the underlying component that is kind of invisible like link is injecting it once somewhere here. I think it's that one. Yeah, it's that one. So if you, but let's make it, let's actually look at a more interesting one. So if we have the title, the item one, obviously there is no style within the item, yet the items appear a lot of times. So it's actually really, really optimized, because when you server render, we're only including the critical styles that are needed for that particular representation of the page automatically. So you don't have the big style sheets with it's kind of like code splitting for styles, because when you include bootstrap.css, you're including a component to render a password field right to left and at a certain size that you probably never use. So with component-styled collocation and deduplication, you're only rendering the styles that you actually need. And because we don't reinvent CSS from scratch, we do all of this with ahead of time compilation. So when you build the project, all the styles are compiled, and they're never compiled again. So the user only gets the resulting CSS. So TLDR, with this, you get the UX of a single-page application with the initial performance of a website from the 1980s, which is really cool. So this is a little bit more advanced. Are we out of time? We start at 2:30? Okay. Yeah, it's a long presentation. So route masking is really cool. We said that pages map to URLs, but what about fancy URLs, right? Like, there are situations where like you want to have, we do, site.co/username, for example. So one restriction that we introduce into the system is we don't want to load a gigantic route map with every page. So the client and the server need to be able to negotiate what each URL means. So this gets a little technical, but imagine that we wanted to implement Instagram's fancy URL scheme, which is /p/UID. For Next, we would have to turn it into a page, which would be photo, for example, which would be inside the pages directory, which would have an ID of a certain kind. So that's where the as attribute comes in. You use the actual component as the href, but then you tell Next, what do you want that to look like when it's clicked? So you do this on the client part. On the server part, okay, so this is our, oh, that's why the presentation was so slow, probably, because it's been loading all these GIFs on the background, I think. Or not, because they're not loaded yet. So we created a clone of Instagram, which I embedded into this presentation, that gets GIFs from a website called GiphyCat. Okay, that's. So we embedded the Instagram URL scheme inside our own URL scheme, and we're able to, we do this with AS, but then when you go to the URL and you server render it, you want the server to be able to understand that. So the server also needs instructions to say /p/something has to be turned into the underlying photo component. So you have to define the two mappings, but the advantage that this gives you is that there is no global route map that describes everything in your application, and there is no performance drawback whatsoever to using fancy routes. So this is a very significant improvement over other approaches where you have to define an object of routes, or you have to, every time you start, you have to define a huge list of things. And then that can actually grow quite a bit and become not performant at all. So this is basically on the left-hand side, the declarative API. And by declarative API, I mean how you would write down the components. And on the right-hand side, the imperative version of that. So I gave you, why is this relevant? I gave you the example earlier where in our website, if you right-click, you go to logos. So we do that by subscribing to the on double-click event, we call it router.push, and on the on hover of the logo, we call it router.prefetch. So that gives you basically, it's very, very simple. Another really neat thing is that when you're developing, all you have to run is Next. So like you have a project. I don't have the tooling, but I would tell you what I would do. I would run npm installed react dom next -- save, and then I would run Next. And then that would launch a local server. It would look for my pages, so it would create my pages component. I would do And that's basically all you have to do. So if I have that and I run Next, I go to localhost 3000, and then I change something, you would see the browser react to your change in real time. That's because Next wires up hot module replacement on your behalf. But we also made hot module replacement extremely scalable. So in our repository, we have thousands of components. So if Webpack, which we build on top on, had to keep track, monitor, and reload every component in the system, it would take minutes to process every change. And in fact, that happened to us at some point. You would save, and it would take half a minute to give you the hot module replacement. So what Next does as well, because we already have this really neat separation with pages, we have to only monitor the ones that are actually rendering while you're developing. So if you're developing Next news and you go to localhost 3000/item, we only monitor the components and the subtree related to item, so that when you make a change, it's extremely efficient. So we call that hot module replacement subscriptions. Yeah, and it improves performance dramatically for us. So this is a nice thing that you get out of the box as well. Immutable build artifacts. So I mentioned earlier, something that is easy to get wrong is the distinction between a development build and a production build. So if I wanted to package this project for production, I would run next build, and then I would run next start. So that's all it takes to package this application into production mode. So typically, I'll show you the relevant section in the README. If you want to try out Next tonight, I encourage you to go through the README, make a simple application, and then you can learn how to deploy it in production. So you get all this really neat performance optimizations. So what you have to define in your package.json is the dev task. So when you're developing, you would run npm run dev, and then this too, we use automatically when you deploy with now. So if you press now enter, that's basically, we'll take the project, we'll build it, we'll start it, and then you get a URL like this. And in addition to Next, you can deploy pretty much anything, API servers, GraphQL servers, static sites, anything you want. So it's very, very easy to go to production. And something we do for production is we make sure that components are ever only downloaded once by clients. So we automatically set up everything that has to do with using unique component names that are content addressable, so that if you come back later, you don't have to re-download a certain JavaScript file. So it ends up being very performant because the only thing that changes when you come back later to a page is the resulting HTML. Like let's say you're looking at a dashboard or a newsfeed. You go to it, you would get the new HTML, and then it's likely that the script tags you've already downloaded before, and they can be cached forever because they're content addressable, because they're addressed by a hash of its contents. So it's super fast. And we even deal with the situation of what happens if I'm on the front page here, and someone deployed from my team, and I press home, or a page that I had never visited before, and the content ID that I was expecting is not returned by the server, it falls back to a client-side transition. So what this means is that you could have teams deploying your application hundreds of times a day, and there would never be conflicts with scripts that have been downloaded by clients that have not refreshed their tabs. So this is an interesting concern with sophisticated JavaScript applications. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, a really cool thing about Next is that it's agnostic to the data model that you want to use. So this is an example of using Redux in connection with Next. All you do is you decorate the project that you export, the component that you export. You can basically, anything that has get initial props, you can get anything from there. So we have examples for a lot of different varieties of data fetching approaches. So that's my parting recommendation will be check out the examples, check out this blog post, where we just introduced the latest version, and we have, so it's /blog/next2. You're going to see a lot of examples here of things that you can do with Next. So custom routing, flow, different CSS systems, how to do the little like nice bar at the top when you like the orange thing you see there at the top. So any possible example you get. So that's it for today, and thanks for being with me today and watching. Thank you.